Good afternoon, dear friends. I am Evely, and today I will tell you a true story. Enjoy your viewing. The legends whispered of her origin, but none truly knew. She was called Lilith, a name once sweet on the tongues of men, now coated in the bitter ash of dread. Centuries ago, Lilith had been a healer in a forgotten village nestled deep within a forest that no map dared chart. Her beauty was matched only by her compassion, but fate bore little regard for kindness. One fateful winter, her village fell under the grip of an unholy plague. The dead festered in the streets, their mouths frozen in silent screams. Lilith, desperate to save those she loved, sought out an ancient witch who dwelled in a cave veiled by eternal fog. The witch, her eyes like blackened embers, promised a cure, but at a price. Lilith would have to bind her soul to an ancient being slumbering beneath the earth, a forgotten god who demanded blood as sustenance. Blinded by her desperation, Lilith accepted. The ritual was a torment beyond mortal comprehension. Her body torn apart and remade, her veins filled with shadow. When she awoke, she was no longer the healer but something monstrous. Her hunger for blood was insatiable. The villagers, once her friends, became her first feast. She slaughtered them under the pale moonlight, their screams echoing through the hollowed woods. Lilith did not age, nor did she die. Her skin remained pale as moonlight, her eyes glinting crimson like twin dying suns. She roamed the land, leaving destruction in her wake. Wherever she walked, crops withered, animals fled, and storms howled. The witch's curse granted her not only immortality but also power over the unseen. She could command shadows to strangle the living, whisper nightmares into the ears of the pure, and summon storms that devoured entire villages. Over the centuries, Lilith learned to harness her abilities. She could walk through mirrors, slipping from one world to the next like a wraith. Fires extinguished at her whim, and the very air seemed to recoil in her presence. Yet her hunger never waned. She drained the life from anyone she encountered, leaving behind only withered husks and silent homes. It was in a forgotten hamlet, where alone and clung to the edge of a mist-drenched moor, that her legend grew darker. The innkeeper, a man named Harold, was a widower with a young daughter, Clara. Lilith arrived as a wandering traveler, her cloak drenched and her eyes pleading for refuge. Harold, though wary of her unsettling aura, allowed her to stay. That night, the other guests began to vanish. One by one, they disappeared, their rooms left undisturbed except for a faint metallic smell. Clara awoke in the dead of night to see Lilith standing over her bed, her crimson eyes glowing. Frozen with fear, she could only watch as Lilith smiled, revealing teeth like shards of glass. By morning, Harold found his daughter gone. In the cellar, he discovered the truth. Clara's lifeless body, drained of blood, lay crumpled like a discarded doll. Lilith stood in the corner, her face serene and stained crimson. Harold tried to flee, but the shadows themselves grabbed him, dragging him back to her. The inn became a tomb. Travelers who sought refuge never left. Some tried to escape, but the mist outside grew thicker, blinding and choking them until they stumbled back to the inn's doorstep, where Lilith waited. Lilith's presence was accompanied by horrors beyond comprehension. Windows reflected not the interior of the inn but grotesque visions of torment. The walls whispered secrets in languages no one understood. Guests reported waking up paralyzed, their bodies floating inches above their beds, unable to scream as Lilith's voice filled their minds with promises of eternal hunger. A scholar who sought to study the phenomenon attempted to confront Lilith with holy relics. The crucifix in his hand crumbled to dust the moment he approached her. He recited prayers, but the words twisted in his mouth, transforming into guttural pleas for mercy. Lilith consumed him last, dragging him into a mirror where his screams echoed endlessly. As Lilith roamed, tales of her atrocities spread. Villages fortified their gates, but it was futile. She would slip through cracks, her laughter carrying on the wind. Entire towns vanished, their residents found weeks later as desiccated corpses piled high in grotesque towers. Some survivors spoke of her eyes, how they seemed to bore into their very souls, rendering them unable to flee. In one chilling account, a family tried to hide in a church. The father boarded up the windows while the mother prayed fervently at the altar. But when night fell, the candles extinguished themselves, and the stained glass windows bled darkness. Lilith emerged from the shadows, her voice soft and mocking. By dawn, the family was gone, and the church was a smoldering ruin. Lilith's hunger drove her to seek more than just solitary victims. She began to amass followers, those she didn't kill outright but instead twisted into undead servants. They worshipped her as a dark goddess, spreading her influence like a plague. Towns fell one by one, their people either devoured or enslaved. Her empire grew in the shadows, her grip tightening on the world. The skies darkened as her power grew. Animals fled entire regions, and the earth itself seemed to rebel, splitting open to reveal chasms of writhing darkness. Those who dared resist her found their own loved ones turned against them, their corpses puppet by Lilith's unholy will. The world began to feel her suffocating grasp. Crops failed, rivers ran red, and storms raged ceaselessly. Survivors whispered of her name, their voices trembling. They knew there was no escape, no hope. Lilith's empire spread like a plague. Entire continents fell under her dominion. The skies, once blue, darkened with storms that never ceased. Lightning split the heavens, casting her sprawling dominion in brief, jagged flashes of light. Her servants, the Forsaken, were an abomination of twisted flesh and mind. Their bodies moved with unnatural jerks, as if their strings were pulled by some unseen puppeteer. Their faces bore grotesque smiles, the kind that never reached their dead, hollow eyes. The living became nothing more than cattle to feed her unending hunger. Cities were transformed into ghastly farms. Towering black spires rose from the ruins, their surfaces slick with a black ichor that pulsed like a heartbeat. Around these monoliths, fields stretched endlessly, fields not of crops, but of people. The farms were nightmarish. The air reeked of decay and iron, and the ground was slick with blood that seeped from the thousands of bodies tethered to the earth by writhing, shadowy tendrils. Each victim was emaciated, their limbs atrophied, their faces contorted in silent screams. Their veins bulged unnaturally, siphoning blood upward into the spires where it was collected and purified into a dark, shimmering substance that sustained Lilith's power. The farms were patrolled by the Forsaken, who dragged the living from their hiding places and bound them to the feeding pits. Those who resisted were not simply killed, they were displayed, crucified on jagged iron poles, their insides spilling out, their eyes glowing faintly with the residue of Lilith's magic. They were left alive just long enough for the others to hear their tortured wails. At the heart of her empire stood the Cathedral of Shadows, a sprawling citadel forged from black stone that seemed to drink in light. Its spires twisted unnaturally toward the sky, writhing as if alive. The cathedral was not merely a building. It was an entity, a living construct that pulsated with malevolent energy. Its walls whispered blasphemies in 1,000 languages, and its corridors shifted constantly, trapping intruders in endless, nightmarish loops. Inside, Lilith ruled as a queen and goddess. Her throne, carved from the fused bones of her first victims, sat atop a dais that wept black tears. The air inside the cathedral was heavy with despair. Those who entered described an unbearable weight pressing down on their chests, as if the very walls mourned their existence. Some swore they could hear their own names whispered from the shadows, promises of freedom laced with venom. Lilith's presence was overwhelming. She floated inches above the ground, her feet never touching the cursed earth. Her crimson eyes glowed with an unholy light, and her hair writhed like serpents. Her voice, sweet and melodic, carried commands that no one could resist. Even the bravest fell to their knees before her, begging for mercy she would never grant. Her court was populated by the broken remnants of humanity, those she had twisted into creatures of her design. Vampiric knights clad in blackened armor stood as her enforcers, their swords humming with an energy that disintegrated flesh on contact. Her concubines, pale and ethereal, floated silently around her, their eyes black voids that reflected the horrors of eternity. Hope was a forgotten concept. Those who attempted to rebel found themselves ensnared in Lilith's traps. One such resistance group, the Vanguard, sought to destroy a feeding spire. They devised a plan to plant explosives at its base, hoping to sever the flow of blood. They moved under cover of night, their movements precise, their resolve unshakable. But Lilith had already seen their plans. As they approached the spire, the shadows themselves came alive. Long, spindly arms with clawed fingers emerged from the darkness, tearing their group apart. One by one, they were dragged into the black abyss, their screams echoing long after they were gone. Another survivor, a young woman named Elise, fled from the farms with her child. She hid in the ruins of a city, praying for salvation. For days, she evaded the Forsaken, but her luck ran out when she stumbled into a mirror. Her reflection did not mimic her movements but instead stared back with a knowing smile. Lilith stepped out of the glass, her crimson eyes alight with amusement. Elise's screams were muffled as the mirror consumed her and her child, leaving behind only an empty street and an eerie silence. Lilith's dominion grew until there was no corner of the world untouched by her influence. The oceans boiled, their surfaces writhing with black mist. The forests rotted, their trees twisting into grotesque shapes that clawed at the sky. The very stars seemed to dim as her power grew. Humanity dwindled to a fraction of its former numbers. Those who remained were either bound to the feeding farms or turned into Forsaken. The lucky few who managed to hide in the deepest caves or the highest mountains found themselves haunted by visions of Lilith, her voice taunting them even in their dreams. The earth itself seemed to mourn. Earthquakes tore through the land, and volcanoes spewed ash that blocked out the sun. The planet was dying, drained of life to fuel Lilith's endless feast. Lilith turned her gaze to the heavens. The blood she had consumed allowed her to pierce the veil between worlds. Her Forsaken constructed a massive gateway in the heart of her cathedral, its surface swirling with dark energy. With her armies, she stepped through, intent on spreading her curse to other realms. The multiverse became her hunting ground. Planets fell one by one, their inhabitants either consumed or enslaved. The stars themselves began to wink out, as if extinguished by her hunger. She became a force of nature, a living apocalypse. Back on Earth, the last survivors whispered prayers to gods who no longer listened. They knew their end was near, but some clung to a final hope, that Lilith's hunger would someday consume itself, leaving nothing but silence. But even silence feared Lilith. Thank you for watching. Support me with a like and a subscribe. Thank you. See you in another video. Bye.